Hey y'all, how we doing? Shout out once again to Bear Nation for tuning in to another episode of the Bear Necessities podcast. I am your host, Rob Napoli. The Bear Necessities is a podcast where we sit down with entrepreneurs, ecosystem partners, and innovation folks to talk about what it takes and means to launch, create, and scale business across the world. We talk about the journey and the challenges of being entrepreneurial minded and how that translates into your journey, giving you the tools and knowledge to overcome challenges that you may be facing in your life's journey. The Bear Necessities is part of the Rise Up Media family, and we thank you for tuning in. Now, let's get into the show. Hey y'all, how we doing? We're back again for another episode of the Bear Necessities podcast. And today is going to be a fun one. Is my man, Collin Mitchell, is joining me. He's a 4-time founder. He's passionate as well about entrepreneurship, as well as sales and podcasting. So when him and I met, it was like an immediate vibe. And I think we had like a 30-minute intro call that we talked for like an hour and a half. And it was kind of like, oh shit, like we need to like probably get moving. And I got to join his podcast pretty early. It's how we got to be introduced. And since then, we've grown great relationship. He is the co-founder of Salescast. It's the only revenue-first podcast agency for entrepreneurs and sales leaders. He lives in LA with his beautiful wife and 3 kids, with number 4 due soon. Like as we're recording this, 4 is on the way soon. Collin, say what's up to Bear Nation for me.
What's up, Bear Nation? I'm excited to get into this. I know that we're going to have fun. I've had you, Rob, on my show twice now, and probably the hardest part is going to be trying to keep it to 30 minutes.
I know. Every time we talk, it's like, never stays on track. I remember one time, I think I called you and I was like, hey, do you have a quick second? I have a quick question. He's like, yeah, I got 2 minutes. And the conversation went for like 12. And it's like, hey, shit, we got to go. Like, move it on. So we'll see what we can make happen.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we vibed with early when we chatted, because we got introduced by a mutual friend, I came on your pod. And originally we were talking sales, right? Because I was running a sales and service company, but I also had my training and development company. And you had this kind of sales background. But I thought was the most fun was the conversations that happened after the show. As we got to know each other, we stopped talking about sales and really got into entrepreneurship and what that means. And you're a 4-time founder. Give us a little bit of your journey and how you got into this idea of entrepreneurship and why you wanted to take on starting something when you were a VP of sales at like 24, like making good money as a VP. Like, kind of give me a little bit of your journey into why you left that VP sales title into like, I'm going to start my own company at 25 and now launch 4 new businesses.
Yeah. The short answer is I'm not a good employee.
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs, I think have some similar traits, right? We're typically a little bit stubborn, have a lot of drive and motivation and don't like being kept in like a box of thinking outside of that box and, doing different things. And as an employee, even in a, VP of sales position, you still have some constraints on like what you can do and what you can't do. And you don't really feel like you can really get, maximize your full potential when you have that entrepreneurial, spirit. To take it back just a little bit, right? So I actually grew up poor. I was raised by a single mom. My dad was never around, and it was a struggle with my mom and 4 boys just to keep food on the table and pay the rent, and we came up short often. I didn't have a lot of positive role models telling me like, hey, school was important or anything like that. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was a irresponsible, kind of troubled young adult. I had to literally beg for my first sales job. Like my stepdad, who was no longer with my mom, was in sales, and he was making good money, and I thought that was my way out. I mean, he didn't quite trust me to stick his neck out there, so I had to beg for that job. And then when I got it, I worked my tail off, worked my way to the top, got a VP of sales position at a competitor, learned a little bit more business acumen there. But then eventually thought, hey, my wife was in recruiting at the time. We were just dating, and she was really unhappy. She came over and joined me and my team with what we were doing. We drove millions of dollars in revenue there. And then one day it was just like, I think we could do this on our own. And our first business we started in 2010. We were a bit of an IT VAR, so we sold into like government and K through 12, and we sold office equipment, supplies, hardware, software, things like that. And we built that company to 5 million in 26 months with $0 spent on marketing, all fueled by an outbound sales team.
I love that. I mean, the fact that you, and this is kind of a very transitional tale of one, it's, you started doing something and got so good at it. It's like, how can we figure out how to do this on our own and get out of the grind of working for somebody else and into our own space? And, you know, it's funny you talk about your wife working in recruiting. I know that space well. I spent almost 10 years in it, and it is a grind. You learn the best things about sales and some of the worst things about people in sales.
Yeah. The interesting thing is she actually started out of college in London. And over there, recruiting is very different than it's done in the U.S.
I work for a London-based global firm. I started recruiting for like a local firm, and then I worked for like a big global corp. Oh man, very different. I learned that firsthand.
They definitely live up to the name of true headhunting. You know, and that's what she was used to, and it was very different here, and she didn't like it. So I was like, why don't you come over here? We're having fun, we're making money, like, and then our first office was our, you know, 1-bedroom apartment. Moved some furniture around in the living room, slapped 2 big desks there, and just really kept our expenses low and grinded it out, and built that company, and then got our first office, and it was a wild ride. And then, you know, I kind of get bored easy, to be honest. I like a challenge. The part that I think scares a lot of people in entrepreneurship is really where I excel well and really lights me up. It's that really early stage, like gritty startup, still trying to figure things off, like taking off in the airplane without the landing gear sort of phase. And that's the part that I really like, is like taking something that's nothing and turning it into something that people actually care about.
Yeah. I mean, that's what excites me too. I'm the same way. I get bored pretty easily. And I think it's a lot of fun to kind of build something new and figure it out as you go. What was it like working with, you know, your partner at the time and starting a company as you're still figuring out, because you were still dating at the time when you launched the company. You know, you have like the business side of things, the personal side of things. How did that work out, or how did you navigate those waters? And was there ever a time when like personal and business kind of conflicted, and how did you manage those kind of relationships with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think everybody probably would have said, hey, it's a bad idea. I don't know that too many people told us that, right? But you know, they were thinking it like, this is a bad idea, right? And maybe for some people it is. But you know, when we met, like we were both just at a certain place in our life where like we just knew we were right for each other, and we had like great communication. And you know, most people probably like think we're BS, but like we still to this day, you know, 7 years later after being married, you know, we rarely fight. Like we just, you know, I think starting a business together really like set the foundation of our relationship in a different way, because we have like respect for each other's roles, and our roles have like changed a little bit, right? She's, you know, full-time at home with the kids. And so there wasn't a lot of challenges, to be honest. We kind of stayed in our lanes. Like, you know, she did all of the things that I wasn't capable of doing. I'd say the biggest thing is we really balance each other out a lot, especially in business, because I'm more of a risk taker. She's a little bit more conservative. And so like, you know, having to kind of reel me back a little bit sometimes, I needed that. And then pushing her a little bit beyond her comfort zone is where I could sort of balance her too. So it worked really well. And then eventually, once we had our first kid, then, you know, she's, you know, basically, you know, was at home most of the time, but I still to this day, like keep her informed in business and run things by her and seek her counsel, because she knows me better than anybody. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I think there's no right or wrong way, on who you partner with. There's tons of stories, and it could be solo founder, multiple founder. And there are stats saying like, you know, people invest in multiple founders more than solo founders. But coming down to all of it, the one thing that, my company, Haptic Group, that just got acquired, Phil and I were friends and had been friends for 3 years. And, the first thing we did, I think, similar to what you just said, is we sat down and put all of the expectations on the table. This is what your role is. What this is my role is. This is our friendship. This is our business. And this is what we expect out of each other. And you have the final say here. And I'm going to back you 100%. If you say, Rob, this is my call, I'm going to back you 100%, and vice versa. And when you set those clear expectations, like, that's what has to happen. And so many founders don't. And I think that also set a huge foundation for just your relationship as a whole and the way that you go back and forth and kind of lay that out. So I think that's awesome that she's still, and I'm sure she probably sometimes is, happy to be out of the business, but also itching to get back in and probably, hey, you're, Chris may be doing this, all these things. So I can only imagine. I've never met her before, but I'm just like, knowing you, I'm just imagining that's the kind of person she is and whatnot. So
yeah, no, you're actually very hit the nail on the head. Like, there's definitely moments where she's like, can we trade spots today? Like,
and we kind of might like that from time to time.
The funny thing is like, sometimes we kind of joke, right? Like, I get to go to work to take a break.
Yeah. I love it. So, you started 4 companies and you had like the agency, the IT services, and kind of growing. And then, I think it was 2 years ago, you met Chris, your current co-founder of Salescast. And what made you say, I'm going to step away from this one thing that you built, your own company, and now step into this other company and start something new? And how did that relationship form? How did you and Chris meet? Tell me a little bit about the foundations of Salescast.
Yeah. I'll take you back just a little bit to give you a little timeline and then answer your question. So I started that first company in 2010. We grew it to 5 million. In there, then I started another business, a unified communications business, which I recently exited. And then the agency that I had was kind of really short term, and that was probably my one major fail as a business. Just wasn't for me. And then about maybe about 2 years ago, Chris and I first met actually when he was working at a growth marketing agency, and they did some work for my unified communications company. And then we sort of lost touch, and I hadn't heard from him in a while. And then I came across his content on LinkedIn. And it was, not the typical, hey, everything's great, look at me, I'm the best, thought leader and, killing it on life and business, content that you see. It was just real, authentic content that at that time, not a lot of people were sharing. I think you're starting to see a little bit more of a transition where people are being a little bit more real about, the good, bad, and in between of what's really going on with entrepreneurship or life or business or. And so it really attracted me, and I slid into his DMs, and I was like, hey, I'm super curious, like, what the heck are you doing? And he wasn't really quite sure what he was doing. He was really just had a couple of clients, and he was doing content. And he invited me to his studio to come on his podcast. And I'd never been on a podcast. And I hadn't really invested a ton in my personal brand up until that point. I was more of a lurker and more of like a person that took more than they gave from the social platforms, for sure. I was strictly using them mostly as like generating leads. What can I get from them? And I went on that podcast. I had a great experience, and I was like, I think, I want to start a podcast. Can you help me? And he's like, yeah, sure. And I was like, dude, I'm super busy. I have 3 companies. I have 3 kids. Like, I can maybe do like 1 or 2 episodes per month. And he's like, sure, just whatever you're comfortable with, And then one of his clients at the time had like one of the top HR podcasts and had been doing podcasting for a long time, and said, oh no, you can't do 1 or 2 a month. He's like, first of all, you got to release 20, you got to record 20 and release them daily. And then Apple will pick you up in their algorithm and list you on the new Noteworthy, and you'll have a super successful show early on. Yeah. I was like, hey, this dude sounds like he knows what he's talking about. This is way more than I planned on doing. However, I'm going to listen to him because I don't know anything about podcasting at this point. And we recorded 20 and we released them daily. and we did not get listed in the new Noteworthy. We did not hack the Apple podcast algorithm. Yeah. Since then, I've heard from a few people, yeah, that was a thing like 10 years ago. It doesn't work anymore.
That was the original growth hack for podcasting.
Yeah, and to be fair, like he didn't know. It worked for him, 10 years ago, right? But what it did is it started to kind of strengthen our relationship, and we got to see how we worked together, and we started to create process around creating content in a high frequency. And originally I was still running my unified communications company, and the strategy there was like, hey, I was interviewing entrepreneurs and founders that were basically ideal prospects for my company, and it wasn't working extremely well. But the one thing that kept coming up is people were saying, hey, I think I want to start a podcast. Where do I get started? How can you help me? You know? And so initially I sent them a couple referrals, and then it kept happening. And I was like, I think we're kind of onto something here. And it was sort of timed with another experience that I had where I went on a podcast. Now I'm, thinking I'm big shot. Second podcast I've been on. Like I'm thinking, I'm pretty, cool stuff here. It went on the podcast, and it was the worst experience ever. It was like 10 minutes, and then he tried to sell me some high ticket, 5 or 10K package. I can't remember. Like immediately after we stopped with the, he stopped recording, tried to sell me something, and I was pretty upset, that he basically prospected me in that way and sort of wasted my time. He was trying to sell me on starting a podcast, and I already had a podcast, which was hilarious. And then all my best ideas typically come in the shower. So I was taking a shower, and I was like, you know what? That was actually a great idea. It was just poor execution. And I realized like this actually works extremely well if done right. If you really truly try to, target the right people, add value, collaborate, create content together, show that you're interested, give them a good experience, like stay top of mind. It works really well when done right. He just didn't do it right. And then that's kind of like, there's people who sell right and there's people who don't.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I love how, it was just kind of organic. You saw something that you vibed with, you reached out at a good conversation, and just things kind of naturally happen. And then I think to have that bad experience, and you being an idea guy like you are, and seeing some of this stuff work, and it's like, okay, the other thing's going well, and it's time for maybe to maybe let that kind of go on autopilot, pass that off, and time to take my next entrepreneurial journey, and this kind of arise. And for those that don't know who we're talking about, Chris Edwards, right, is Collin's co-founder and super awesome dude. He was the one who interviewed me for my first episode and kind of supported the launch of the show. As the Salescast team has helped, Collin helped me launch my podcast. And I have a very, real reaction to that, because I wanted to do a podcast for years. And, people said podcasts are dead. And part of it was, focus. And I had all these ideas. And, I think it's really interesting, like this time and place, is that podcasts have been around for a long time. But the way we consume content and the way we consume podcasts has just evolved with the evolution of technology. And I think it's still a great time to have a podcast, to leverage that for many different ways and things you want to do, whether that's, driving sales and potential clients by starting a relationship through a podcast, and not selling them, but driving that relationship to,
that's the key.
Topics that you want to talk about, to, try to make it into more of a monetization platform and like really kind of fun show. And it just depends, right? And I think while these two things over here, topics you love to talk about, monetization, you think about these shows like the sports shows, et cetera, it's cool, but like those are passion projects and kind of a different lane. And what a lot of people are over here in the business world, like how do we continue to grow, learn, meet people, develop organic, authentic relationships? It kind of goes back to your story of social, which you shared a lot about. You talked about my book and used that to show about like, and you've been really authentic, is that we need to be authentically us and have real conversations and create opportunities to have real discussions. And a podcast is a great way to do that. And it's also a great way for listeners to listen to great guests, develop a relationship with them just by hearing their podcast and connecting to their story and reaching out. And that's why it's so amazing the type of content you can create doing this. So I love what you guys have been doing. And as we look at heading into, March and kind of rounding out Q1 here, what are some of the big things that you've been doing at Salescast, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned over the last year that you're excited to like, hey, we messed this up and we're really excited about this because it allows us to build this for the next year. And we kind of headed to year 2.5 really, but I'm calling it, full year 2.
Yeah. We've learned a lot, in a short period of time. We've got almost 75 shows in our network now. Mm-hmm. And we used to think we had a pretty good idea of like what our ideal customer was, right? And that's sort of it's changed and evolved over time, right? We thought everybody should use their podcast to prospect or, I call it prospect, but really build relationships, right? Mm-hmm. And not everybody wants to use it that way. We've started to learn the different ways that people can use a podcast to drive revenue. Yeah. And we've started to identify who we serve best and who we don't. Mm-hmm. And Chris and I had 1,400 conversations with people last year that were somewhere in their podcast journey, meaning they wanted to guest on shows, they wanted to start a show, or they had a show and maybe just didn't have a strategy, or it was driving zero revenue, right? So all people who were at different phases of their journey, beginning at the very beginning, or maybe had already started. And there was a lot of people that we couldn't serve. Yeah. And that was kind of one of the main reasons that we, shifted the community. The community that we started was originally a sales community, right? Which made sense because I have a pretty successful sales podcast, and I was trying to be unique and different than all the other, sales communities that are out there, and it just really wasn't possible. And then Amy and Chris were both saying, hey, it needs to be a podcast community. And I wasn't really hearing that. And then eventually it sort of clicked. Yeah. And I was like, there really isn't very many good quality podcast communities out there. Most of them are on Facebook, and most of them are people who are doing it more of a hobby, which is totally nothing wrong with that. But, they have a 9 to 5 and they do their podcast on the weekends, and maybe they talk about sports. Maybe they talk about, something that's not business related in a lot of cases. But there wasn't really a B2B podcast community for people who are focused on using it as part of their job, or as an entrepreneur, or as a sales leader to drive revenue, to develop a platform, to find their voice, to build relationships, to open doors, to drive revenue. And that's when we made that shift. Yeah. And also another big driver for us is there's 2.7 million podcasts published today. Yeah. And only half of those still release episodes. And so, a lot of that is because they don't have the tools, they don't have the support, they don't have the resources, they don't have the peers to have it be a successful activity for them. So they give up. And so the community is sort of our way to serve all those people that we couldn't help, throughout those conversations, and to help close the gap of, less of those shows that, have to do it on their own failing.
Yeah, I remember when you came to me about the idea of the community, we talked a lot about it. I shared some different platforms. We talked about Slack or other platforms. Yeah. I remember you asked me to be a community leader for the entrepreneurs. And, I remember as we quickly got into it, we realized really quickly that this is not the community you wanted to build, and it shifted really quickly. And when we saw that shift happen, it was it was like putting gas to a flame. Like how many people joined.
The whole energy, changed.
And I'm in way too many Slack groups. I've actually cut about a lot of them. Yeah. And some of them are dead, and some of them just talk about nothing. But what I love about this one is I can check it every day, and there's always some new nugget of wisdom. There's something that's really, somebody's asking a question about this or that, or guesting. And it's a great opportunity too, to create relationships with other podcasters who are struggling with the same thing. It's hey, Edward from Level Up Show, who is part of the Salescast community. He's hey, Rob, he's hey to the group, hey, 2 of my guests this week backed out. I need to release an episode. Who can help? And I literally messaged him, hey, I got time tomorrow morning. What works? Literally within, 12 hours later, we were jumping on a podcast so that he can keep his episode flow going. And sometimes that happens and you don't know where to go get a guest. And you can drop that in the community, and the community responds in kind. And that's what I think is so unique about what you're building, and really thinking about this goes back to being authentically you and what you're trying to build. And the lessons that many of us need to learn is that we can create businesses to serve everyone, but we don't need to. We got to niche out. We got to find that authentic, you can call it your tribe, whatever, right? Riches and niches. You need to find kind of where you can go deep before you can go wide. right? And that's one of the things that you all learn. And I loved watching that and kind of being a part of that a little bit from the outside in, and being a part of the community. And I think that's been a really cool thing to see, like, what has happened for y'all. So with like these lessons learned and kind of creating that community, what's on deck for 2022 with Salescast, and what are you looking to really accomplish this year, having grown so many to 75 shows and, hopefully growing more? Like, what does that growth look like for y'all?
Yeah. So, I mean, our big mission, right, is to connect 100 million sellers to the power of story through podcasting, right? And really change the way that people do B2B sales, right? That's one of the things that I love about podcasting is the single activity accomplishes so many things, right? I mean, opening doors, building relationships, yes. If you're a seller, if you're an entrepreneur, like your personal brand, obviously you get it, right? Mm-hmm. Like your personal brand is important. And if you're not investing in it, it's hard. As an entrepreneur or a founder that sells, or a startup where you have a million things to do, like taking time to really do your personal brand right and create original content consistently is hard. And a podcast solves a lot of those things for you. Like,
the approach, right? Audio, video, and written, right? Podcast show notes, audio, transcripts, and the video that you get out of it.
Exactly. So there's that. And then, I still believe, like, as an entrepreneur, like, sales is the number one skill that you should have. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, and let's say you're a technical founder and you build stuff, then I think it makes a lot of sense to have a co-founder that sells, because you could have the best product, you could have the best service. If nobody can sell it, then nobody cares. And unfortunately, it will probably fail, even if it is the greatest thing. And so, that's, and then really, building relationships. A lot of people tell you in sales, like, oh, you gotta, add value. You hear all these people talking about add value, but they don't tell you really how, right?
I would say, what does value actually mean?
Yeah, it's not sending them an ebook or a blog post that they don't care about. That's not adding value, right? But that's what a lot of people are doing, because they're like, oh, well, this is the only way I know how to add value. But inviting somebody, like saying, hey, Rob, I love the content you're putting out. Love your book. Would love for you to come on my pod, share your story. Mm-hmm. Like, you're collaborating, you're creating content together, you're lifting them up, you're giving them a voice. Like, tell me any other way to add value that's gonna, hit on so many things.
And I love that you say that, because there's two things. Like, one, I was talking with Walker McKay on his podcast, is like, he went back on and we talked about value-added network and what does that actually mean? What does creating a value-added network mean? It means connecting with like-minded individuals that you can either learn from, work with, grow from, they can learn from you. It's different from this idea of, I just want to scroll endlessly following content. It's, I want to follow content that I can engage with, learn from, give value, receive value. It's a two-way conversation. And that's what I think podcasting helps you do, is build that network that's really value add, two-way conversation. The second side of that is the content. And one of the things that I love to do with my show is I have a lot of first-time podcast guests. I mean, when I'm on episode 45, I think 25%, I'm their first ever podcast. And what's interesting is, one, it's a great way to build a relationship. Two, there's some of my best listened to episodes, right? I've gone and gotten some of the big names that everyone else has. They've been on 30 shows. And like, this is me, as I'm getting to my guesting journey of, like, I'm heading on episode 30. Like, I want to make sure that I bring value and that I use different stories, different contexts. It's not, if you listen to Rob across all these platforms, you shouldn't hear the same intro, same story, same background with like one nugget of wisdom. It's like, hey, here's this quick version. Go check out this episode of my podcast so you can get the background. Let's fucking get into it. Right.
Yeah. You know what I love about that?
What?
You know what I love about that most is, number one, you're letting people tell their story for the first time, right? So they're listened to because nobody's ever heard their story before, maybe, right? And then the second part that I love about it is, like, it touches exactly on what I know you care about most, is building that, that value, network, right? And what it is because that's a life-changing experience for some of these people. Like, they're getting to tell their story maybe for the very first time. And you're the one that made that happen, that made it safe, made it comfortable, helped them through it. That's a life change. Like I've had the opportunity to do this a few times, not even probably as many as you. And some of those people, like those are lifelong friends, man. Like, I mean, I remember one guy, he's got an incredible story. And he'd never been on a podcast before, and he had turned down some opportunities, and he came on my show for the first time telling his story. I mean, it totally changed the trajectory of like how he, addressed his personal brand after telling his story for the first time. He went and changed his LinkedIn headline after, based on what we talked about. Like you can't replicate that. No.
And I think too, is so many people tell their story in different ways, but once you kind of put it on a podcast and put it out there and you hear it and you see it, it allows you to really like start to own it and own your brand a little bit. I mean, to be honest, you were the first podcast that I did that got put out. I had recorded 3 episodes. One of them never took off the ground. The second one didn't publish it because I was like episode 5. And after like 3 episodes, I decided it was too much work. And the third just never published it for whatever reason. And probably because, for whatever reason, like I know like, it was a 2-way thing. It wasn't a pretty great episode. I think that I was reaching on things. They were like the questions they asked. It was just not a great episode. And so it didn't make sense to go out. But you were the first episode that I went on, and it went out, and it kind of kickstarted a number of things. And like, here we are, a year and a half later, still, chatting. I've been on your show a couple of times. You're on my show, and we have weekly calls, and, we pass a lot of,
and now you've been on a ton of shows.
Yeah. So I think like it helps. And I think, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs about this, like get on a podcast, and sometimes they need that first one to show they can, especially if they're from another country where you're not sure about their language skills, et cetera, and the level of conversation. So having something that they can tangibly show and say, hey, look, I've been on one show. I'd love to share my story. Here's why I think you're a fit. And it's such a big, powerful thing. And having a space and a place for that. And that doesn't happen without communities like Salescast that you're building that help also empower people to go ask. Because there's people in that community that's never been on a podcast, like, hey, I would love to be a guest. Here's the topics. And like, this is my first foray into doing this. That's powerful to have a space and a place for that. And it's not there the same way that it is here. I think that's something really cool that y'all have done. And I'm glad that it's transformed into this natural thing quickly from what it was to what it is. And that's exciting stuff for the coming year.
Yeah. I mean, even like Amy post in there like, hey, I'm looking for people who want to guest for the first time. Like she loves, just like yourself, bringing on people that have never, been on a show, and naturally are going to be a little nervous and a little uncomfortable. And, it takes a special person, to be able to navigate that and help people be comfortable and tell their story. And it literally can change them forever after that, like getting more comfortable, actually telling your story for the first time. Then you might get more comfortable on social and writing original content and posting videos, and who knows what happens next. And as a sales leader or as an entrepreneur, like these things are extremely important, right? And just get on your first podcast. It doesn't have to be the best podcast. It doesn't even have to be published, maybe. Like just actually, doing it and getting comfortable with that is going to help you in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the thing about the content thing is it's really hard to continue to create content. And we get content, and content's created because we learn something, we internalize it, and we share that to our networks in our own organic way, right? And so to be able to have 2-way conversations with people like this and learn and grow and take that and internalize it. I mean, hell, I've even seen it with the way your content's evolved and the way you talk about your story. And it's like, oh, I remember talking to Collin about that. I remember sharing that story. I remember hearing that and like seeing you internalize it and how it relates to your business. It's like, that is so cool because it allows you to create real, organic, authentic content in a way that's not like, okay, I got to sit down and like, what am I good at? Like, it's like, no, I had this great conversation. It sparked an idea. I'm going to write it down and then turn it into content. And it becomes so much easier. So many people are afraid to create content. And you don't need to create content for content's sake. Create content that is meaningful. It goes back to that word value that we've talked a lot about. And it's just been fun to see. And it's been fun to see you grow in that and to see the business grow. As a 4-time founder, as you look at the business, you've had a lot of success. You've had millions of dollars of revenue. You've had exits. You've had these different things. And here you are in this 4th venture. What do you think has been the biggest takeaway from starting company 4 to the 3 previous?
I think the biggest thing is like, I used to think that people were a little bit BS about like, oh, you have to be passionate about what you do. And like, to be honest, before Salescast, I was never that passionate about what I was selling. It was just like, I was just selling to sell for like, to make a living, to buy a house, to, support a family, to provide jobs for people. Like, none of the things that we actually sold were that anything to be that excited or passionate about. And this is the first time that like I'm super passionate about what I do, and it doesn't feel like work.
I love that.
It's very enjoyable. I love the clients that we get to work with. I feel like we're making a difference in people's lives. And that's, I think, the biggest thing. So, I wish I probably would have bought into that sooner. Yeah. Right. But everything had to happen to get to where I am today. And I would say like, I actually believe that now. And if you would have asked me that, 2-3 years ago, I'd have been like, no, you could sell anything. You don't have to be passionate about it. Yeah.
I think that you can, but it makes a big difference on how, right? When you think about the value side of it. And, there's 2 camps of people. I always talk about this. There's people who have jobs to support other passions, right? They have a great job that allows them to do X, Y, Z, right? Yeah. And there's the people like us who really have to blend passion with our work because we know what it can do for us holistically. And a lot of times, it takes going through exploration that some people never make that kind of transition in. And that's okay, right? If you're happy and you can like leverage into other passions. But when you see that kind of transition in into like when you work in your passion, the amount of value that you can then in turn give and receive just becomes exponential. And, I use that word value again, and it sounds like a fucking cliche. And this is, so many people use it. It's like great for content. But when we think about what actual value is and how we can give and receive it, when that passion comes into play, it just becomes so much more authentic. And this is what your social soul is all about, and the way you create engagement all the time. And I love that you bring that up. I want to ask the question because, it's we glorify all these things, all the positive things. What's been the hardest fucking thing about starting this 4th company? Like, what's been your biggest challenge or the biggest kind of like lesson that you've learned in company number 4?
I would say biggest lesson so far, right? We've had some speed bumps for sure, right? And where, we oversold and had a hard time delivering, or one person on the team gets sick and it's hard. And we have to, Chris had to, work long hours just to get things done. I would say the hardest thing has been just really trying to hone in on, like when you're just getting started, you want to think you can serve everybody.
Yeah.
Like, hey, if they're willing to pay us, they're our client. Like they're our, hey, you're willing to pay, well, you're our ICP. Great.
Yeah.
And starting to get a little bit more disciplined, because the ones that really are not a good fit typically suck a lot of time, require a lot of hands-on, or will churn in some cases. Right. So it's better to get like clear and a little bit more disciplined early on who you can serve best. And sometimes it's hard because you may not know that right away, and you may have to experience firsthand, like who you're not a best fit for in order to understand that. But once you figure it out, staying true and like disciplined to that is extremely important for like scalability.
I can't tell you how much love I have for that statement right there. And I've made that mistake, right? It's really hard to say no to money, especially when you're tight on funds. But if you can stay disciplined and you turn down things that are not a fit and refer them to other places, what that brings back in return is huge. And when you can show success and you really have that growth, I love that you share that, because so many of us oversell and underdeliver at times. And it's not that we did it wrong. It's just that we took on more than we could chew, or we weren't sure about our process because we're still, building the process as we're going. And I think that's, really important. And one of the things that I've always appreciated out of you and Chris is that you own up to that, and that you can have that conversation. You can share that. And if those mistakes do happen, stepping into, hey, we'll get it right. Like, tell us what you need. We'll tell you if we can do it. We'll get it right. And I think providing that level of transparency and service to your clients at any type of business is everything. And that's how you win the relationship. Hey, these things were tough. This are the things we hit. These are the things that we need to do. We'll make it right. It might just be a little longer than we expected. And we have that transparency. It's game changer. I don't know why we hide behind all this shit. Like being transparent, even on the bad things, is the best thing you can do.
Yeah. Being able to communicate, being transparent, but also just being able to like really receive feedback. A lot of people struggle. Like a lot of people will tell you they love feedback until you give them feedback. Mm-hmm. And so, being able to receive feedback and be like, hey, did we actually mess up here? Could we have done better? And owning it. Right. And I think a lot of times entrepreneurs, sellers, sales leaders, they want to put off this, this aura of like, oh, we're all buttoned up and we've got it together and everything's perfect and like there's no problems and like the world's just not that perfect. Like things happen, mistakes happen, we're human, and you actually will earn more trust and respect from people when you're just honest with them, communicate with them, and own up if you make mistakes or if you're going through maybe some growth challenges or whatever the case is. If you could just communicate with people, they'll respect you more than trying to just like BS them or like avoid the conversation or anything like that.
Yeah, you got to lean into those tough conversations. And I love that you say this because, I always joke, I say I'm very coachable and I love feedback. And 9 times out of 10, I am really good at taking feedback. But there are some times that I've realized as I've kind of started to grow a little bit and started to see more success that feedback stings a little bit harder, and I sometimes forget to take that like step back and remove myself. And it was when I did that and I got fired for the first time. It was when I did that and had mistakes on some of our first clients, my first venture. Even with my book, it's like when you take those step back, those moments, and you like absorb that feedback and you own it, the power that you get into owning your mistakes and then how you can translate that to the fix is the way that real growth and innovation happens, because you can actually go fix it versus like you try to act all buttoned up and you kind of push it off and realize that there's still that hole in the back end. It's going to rear its ugly head again. It's how you really fix. So, I feel that on such a personal level. I've gone through that many different phases of my life. And I think it's something that too many entrepreneurs say we're coachable, all these things, but too many people don't actually live that. And like you just explaining that, you showing how you live that is a huge thing. So, yeah. As we kind of head to the end of this episode, I have a few questions I ask on every, but one question I have to throw in is for those out there thinking about starting a podcast, wanting to start a podcast, not sure where to start. Obviously the Salescast community is a huge place for that, but like what advice do you have to those people out there sitting here like listening to this episode and be like, I wonder if I could start a podcast? And what do you tell people when they say that to you?
Yeah, I say yes. They should. Like, there's a lot of people that disagree with me. I believe everybody in sales, every sales leader, every entrepreneur should have a podcast. And there's a lot of people who would be like, oh, we have enough, podcasts out there. But like, not even like with the intention of like, I'm going to have the most popular, top 100 show with, sponsors and all of that. Like, just because of what it will do for you personally and professionally, the growth that will come out of being a podcast host is worth it completely, even if nobody ever listens to your show.
Yeah.
That's not the reality. You're probably going to have some people listen to it, but like just what, how it will transform you as a person, as a sales leader, as an entrepreneur, is worth it 100%. And the main thing is like, just get started. A lot of people get stuck at that. What should I name the show? Is anybody going to listen to the show? How is it going to be different than all the other shows that are out there? Like those are the common excuses that we tell ourselves is why we shouldn't start a podcast.
Yeah.
And the main takeaway here is like, you don't have to have it all figured out. Just get started. And the show probably will not, if you continue with it, right? It probably will not be what you thought it was going to be when you first get started, but you'll never know if you don't get started.
I love that. I love that so much because a couple of reasons. One, you're not starting a podcast to be the next. I know he's embattled right now, but Joe Rogan, right? He's got 10 million followers. Like it's hard not to use him because he's the biggest podcaster in the world. And he is a great host, right? And all views aside, his ability to ask questions and have great guests, like that's what makes him entertaining, right? And not all of us are trying to be a 10 million following podcast with sponsors and have Spotify bias for that. Like that's not why you start a podcast. And I agree with you that podcasting has been one of my most favorite and rewarding experiences. I've worked in recruiting for 10 years. I'm naturally a good question asker and interviewer and host. But what I've learned about how to ask questions, being uncomfortable going a question deeper, the two-way conversation that I've been able to have, and how I've been able to just, I feel, open up and give and receive more, be more empathetic, and think more holistically about a number of different topics that I've discussed on my show. This show is huge. It's allowed me to turn that into so many things in the way I talk to my clients, in the way that I coach my clients, in the way that I engage with others on a daily basis. And people are going to listen. It may not be huge, but there's going to be your core group of people that are going to listen. They're going to listen because of the guests. You're going to have people listening, and you can change it. I mean, my colors have changed a little bit. We changed my cover art. It continues to evolve, like all these things.
The
like
strategy, like everything. Yeah.
Just like a brand. When you start a new business, you can't be perfect. If you try to be perfect, you're already too late. You're never going to do it. Go, grow, evolve. It's such a simple, powerful message. But I loved how you broke it down to like why people should just do it and what they get out of it versus like thinking about it from a monetary end result. So huge.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and the funny thing is all of those things you described, right? Of like the benefits of having your show, like, if I would have told you that before you started the show, like, hey, this is going to happen and this is good, you would have thought I was full of it. Yeah. You'd be like, yeah, dude, you're trying to sell me some magic fairy dust, right? Yeah. Like, but you have to experience it. That's the main thing.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a journey that you have to take on with eyes wide open. And then, I think the big thing is if you're going to do it, you got to put some consistency into it, right? There's going to be good days and bad days. You got to go through the hump. You got to really put that down. Because once you do it, it becomes quite easy in terms of you get excited for a conversation and you can kind of turn up for 30, 45 minutes, record a great episode, and then, pop it out and learn from it. I think it's so huge. So as a 4-time founder, entrepreneur, and having gone through, as we've discussed in the last half hour, good and bad things that you've learned and lessons learned, for those out there listening, it's a show about entrepreneurship. For those that are entrepreneurial minded or thinking about starting a business or thinking about getting into, being their own boss as an entrepreneur, what advice would you give them?
It's similar to the podcast, like, okay, thinking about getting started, like just get started. Maybe you started as a side hustle first. What skills do you need in order to start whatever business you're thinking about? Or maybe you've already started and you're trying to get to the next level to go, all in on entrepreneurship and maybe give up the 9-to-5, right? Yeah. Surround yourself with some like-minded people. Have some people that you can, seek counsel from. Don't try to do it on your own. It's tough. And there's a lot of people that have already done it and people are genuinely willing to help you, like, I know there's a lot of people like you that would just be willing to just, have a 30-minute chat with somebody and maybe, teach them some things that they didn't know or tell them about some things they should consider before going full in entrepreneurship or, how to get started with their personal brand or, things that they just don't know. Whatever it is, bet on yourself and just go for it.
I love that. You said this pre-show, don't overthink and take action, because when you take action, you learn and can cure. Like you leverage that to like cure problems and overcome, right? And I think that that's like such a great key takeaway from this episode is to don't overthink, take action and learn. And I always say when you're curious, you learn. When you learn, you build. When you build, you grow, and good things happen. Besides my own book, The Social Soul, what is a great resource that you would recommend my listeners check out? It could be a show, it could be a book. Obviously, I'll shamelessly plug. If you haven't read it, go buy a copy of The Social Soul. It's been great.
Yeah. I've got my copy, Social Soul, right here.
You got one of the first read copies. You got one of those first read copies. I tell people, when it first printed, I ordered 35, 40 copies, and I sent them out to some people in my network that I wanted to have read and get the ball rolling. and there was an issue with printing on 2 pages that ended up having like a number of things happen. And so like there was like 3 spelling mistakes and 3 like page errors. So I sent all these out and I had to tell people, I was like, hey, like FYI, this is the first read edition. I know there's a few errors. If you catch anything, send me a message. And what was really cool is like I thought that was going to like kill the book. But my network was so amazing, and the people I chose for those first reads gave me great feedback. We caught it all. We were able to get it fixed before it went live, before I sent out a bigger group of, start really pushing it out. And so anyways, you have one of those early copies, and I remember, you kind of gave me some great feedback, and that's like what you talked about earlier in the show, and I think it's great to bring up, is like that feedback was valuable for me. If I hadn't done that, if I hadn't gone through that process, if I hadn't owned up like, hey, there are some issues, this is the first read, but I want to get it in your hands now. Yeah. I might never learn that. I might have sent that out and started shipping and found that out later. And this is why it's important to have those people in that network around you that you trust. Sorry, I was too good of a spot to like share that story.
Yeah. I actually don't read a ton of business or like entrepreneur books. I dive into more like, I really enjoyed your book because it's an easy read. Like you can, kind of learn what you need to get started with your personal brand and how to do it right? Like what is having a social sell versus like trying to social sell, that like you'll find the answers for that. Right. But I do read a lot of sales books. I love sales books. I'm a student of sales, like forever, for life. But a great, there's 2, I would say, entrepreneur podcasts besides this one. Like make sure you hit that subscribe button for sure. That are, pretty well known. There's Startup Hustle and Entrepreneurs on Fire. Those are great entrepreneur shows where you can learn a ton.
I love it. Those are great episodes. Those are some of the, I listen and follow other podcasts to get great ideas and inspiration on some of the topics they dive into and different things like that. So, go check those ones out. I love those as recommendations. Collin, as we kind of end this out, how can people find you? And for those that are interested in the Salescast community and getting involved, how can they get involved in the community and get into being around like-minded podcast individuals like we've built with Salescast?
Yeah. People that are best places just to go to salescast.community. You can get into the free Slack group. Tons going on there. If you're thinking about starting a show, want to start guesting on shows, maybe you've already started, need some help, need some support, tools, resources, that's the best place to get started. And then you can always check out my podcast on whatever platform you're listening to this on. Search out Sales Transformation. We drop 5 episodes a week.
Awesome. I drop 1 a week, and the fact that you are popping out 5 a week and the amount of conversations and great guests that you continue to have just inspires me to a level of where this show can go. And so I'll make sure to drop the Sales Transformation link, your pod link, in the show notes so people can go pick out whatever platform. Check out Collin's podcast. It's great. I'll drop the link to salescast.community if you want to get involved in the group. It is an amazing community and one where you'll find a lot of empathy. And if you're not sure where to get started, you have questions on what to do, how to do, who to talk to, the community is a place for you. And I'll drop your LinkedIn, because also for those that don't know, all you got to do is send Collin a message and say, hey, would love to talk with you about XYZ. This guy will make it happen, give you a calendar link and get on his calendar. If at all you have ever thought about doing a podcast and don't know where to get started, but want to have a conversation, talk to this man right here and just listen to what he has to say, share your story with him and see what's best for you, and hope to see you all in the Salescast community. It's a great place. So Collin, I appreciate you, my guy. This was a lot of fun. I know we could talk forever, but I really appreciate you sharing real, raw insights of some of the things that you've learned as a founder, some of the challenges you faced, and just being open about the things that you've learned to grow in. Because as a 4-time founder and having all the success, it's really easy to be like, hey, I've done this 4 times. I know what the fuck I'm doing. But you're still saying, no, there's so much more I have to learn. There's still so much more that I want to accomplish. And that is what I think is so awesome. That's the true part of being a real human, an authentic person, and somebody who's open to being just dynamic and growth. So I appreciate you. I've enjoyed the show, and I can't thank you enough for being a part of Bear Nation, my guy.
Thanks, man.
Awesome. Well, y'all, until next time, rise up and stay well. Bear Nation, once again, thank you for tuning in and listening to the Bear Necessities podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review. It really does help and means a lot to us at the show. And I want to thank our friends over at Fin. Fin is a social good platform that creates employee engagement and builds culture. It's our mission to support and give back to the communities that we serve around the world. And we do this by giving every guest on our show a $10 donation to the cause of their choosing using the Fin platform. Until next time, thank y'all, stay well, and rise up.